The sun bathed the quiet country road in golden light, a picture-perfect backdrop for Levi Carter and his wife, Grace. At 29, Levi had a calm, grounded demeanor, while 26-year-old Grace radiated energy and joy despite her 7-month pregnancy. Her hand rested on her round belly as their car hummed along toward a peaceful park picnic. "You sure you packed enough?" Grace teased, her eyes sparkling. Levi chuckled. "Enough for a small army. Peter's gonna eat like a king, even in the womb." Their laughter filled the air, but it was cut short by the shrill sound of a police siren. Levi glanced in the rearview mirror, spotting flashing red and blue lights. "What now?" he muttered, pulling over. 2 officers emerged from the patrol car. Mac, tall and sharp-featured, approached Levi's window with a cold glare, while Zane, stockier and just as stern, surveyed the scene from a distance. "License and registration," Mac barked. Levi nodded calmly, handing over the documents. As Mac scanned them, his expression soured. "License is expired," he declared. "We'll have to impound the car." Levi frowned. "That's impossible. My license is valid for 6 more months." Mac's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning me?" Zane stepped forward, his hand hovering over his holster. "People like you need to learn to comply," he said with a sneer. Grace shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her instincts kicking in. Levi, staying composed, opened his door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible. "Look, this has to be a misunderstanding. If there's an issue, I'll pay the fine. Let's not escalate." Mac took a step closer, his posture threatening. Back in the car. "Now!" Grace's heart raced as she watched the interaction. Unable to sit still, she opened her door and got out, clutching her belly. "Please," she implored, her voice steady despite her fear. "We haven't done anything wrong." Mac's gaze shifted to her, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Get back in the car, ma'am." Grace stood her ground, her protective instincts stronger than her fear. "You don't have to do this." Before anyone could react, Zane snatched Levi's car keys and shoved him toward the patrol car. "This is over," he muttered. "Stop!" Grace shouted, stepping forward. But Mac intercepted her, pushing her roughly. She stumbled and fell, her hands instinctively cradling her belly. "Grace!" Levi shouted, breaking free from Zane's grip. He rushed to her side, his heart pounding with panic. But Mac moved faster, grabbing Grace by the arm and hauling her to the patrol car. "Let her go!" Levi yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. But Zane raised his taser, stopping him in his tracks. The scene unfolded in a blur. Mac forced Grace into the back seat of the patrol car and slammed the door. Zane climbed into Levi's car and sped off, leaving Levi stranded, his world spinning out of control. For a moment, Levi stood frozen, disbelief and dread flooding his mind. Then, with a surge of determination, he flagged down a passing car. A kind stranger stopped, and Levi jumped in, directing them toward the city. At the nearest police station, Levi poured out his story, his words tumbling over each other in desperation. But as officers checked their systems, their expressions turned grim. "There's no record of Officers Mac or Zane," one of them said. "No arrest, no car impoundment." Levi's stomach dropped. "How is that possible? I saw them." "This doesn't sound like police," another officer added, his tone cautious. "It could be a gang. They impersonate cops sometimes." Levi's chest tightened. A gang? It sounded horrific, but at least it offered a glimmer of hope. Maybe they wanted ransom. Maybe Grace was still alive. But as the hours dragged on with no calls, no demands, that fragile hope began to erode. Alone in the station's waiting area, Levi clenched his fists, his mind racing. Grace was gone, and he had no idea how to get her back. Levi sat in the cold, fluorescent-lit police station, his thoughts swirling in a vortex of fear and confusion. Hours had passed since Grace was taken, and there were still no leads. The officers had checked their records multiple times. No patrol car matching the description, no officers named Mac or Zane in their department, and no reports of a car being impounded. It was as though the men had vanished into thin air. One officer, a grizzled veteran named Detective Barnes, approached Levi with a cautious look. "I've seen cases like this before," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes, gangs pose as cops to pull off abductions or robberies. They're organized, and they don't leave trails." Levi's chest tightened. "A gang? Then they'll contact me for ransom, right? That's what they want." Barnes sighed, avoiding Levi's gaze. "If that's their motive, yes. But sometimes it's not just money." The words hit Levi like a punch to the gut. He staggered to his feet. "You have to do something. They took my wife. She's pregnant, for God's sake." "We're doing everything we can," Barnes assured him. "We've issued an alert, and we're coordinating with nearby precincts. But these cases, they take time." Time was something Levi didn't have. He stormed out of the station, his mind racing. Every second Grace was gone felt like a lifetime. He couldn't sit idly by and wait. He had to act. Levi began his search in the only way he knew how. He drove to the spot where Grace was taken. The quiet road felt hauntingly different now, every shadow and sound amplified by his desperation. He walked the length of the roadside, searching for anything, a piece of fabric, a tire mark, anything that might be a clue. But the road offered no answers. Over the next few days, Levi turned to every resource he could think of. He contacted friends, family, and co-workers, hoping someone might have connections that could help. He printed flyers with Grace's picture and distributed them throughout the city. He scoured the internet for any reports of similar incidents, hoping for a lead. But as days turned into weeks, the trail grew colder. The police had no updates, and no one had seen or heard from Grace. The lack of information was maddening. Levi barely slept, barely ate. His once steady demeanor was replaced by a frantic energy that bordered on obsession. Then, one morning, Detective Barnes called. "We've been reviewing traffic cameras near the scene," he said. "We found footage of the patrol car, but the plates were stolen. We're still working on it." Levi clung to the small glimmer of hope, but it wasn't enough. He needed answers now. Months passed, and Levi's life began to unravel. He quit his job, unable to focus on anything but finding Grace. His savings dwindled as he hired private investigators and offered rewards for information. He spent hours each day chasing false leads, each one ending in bitter disappointment. His friends and family urged him to move on. "You've done everything you can," his sister Julia told him one evening. "You can't keep destroying yourself like this." Levi shook his head, his eyes hollow. "Grace is still out there. I can feel it. I won't stop until I find her." As the one-year mark approached, Levi stood in his apartment, staring at the wall covered in maps, notes, and photos. His once organized search had become a chaotic mess, mirroring his mental state. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but he refused to give up. That night, as he lay awake in the bed he used to share with Grace, his phone buzzed. The unfamiliar number made his heart race. He answered immediately. "Levi," came a voice, soft and shaky but unmistakable. It was Grace. "Grace, where are you? Are you okay?" he shouted, sitting up. But before she could respond, the line went dead. Levi stared at his phone, his mind reeling. Had he imagined it? Was it a cruel prank? He checked the call log. The number was real. His heart pounding, he turned on his laptop and began tracing the call. He stayed up all night, piecing together clues until he finally pinpointed a location, a remote, isolated area miles outside the city. Without hesitation, Levi grabbed his car keys and drove. His determination burned brighter than ever. Grace was alive, and he was going to find her. The early morning sun was barely visible through thick clouds as Levi's car rumbled down a narrow, unpaved road. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. The location he'd traced from Grace's brief phone call was far from civilization, tucked deep into the woods. Every mile he drove seemed to amplify his anxiety. "What if I'm too late?" he muttered under his breath, but he shook the thought away. Number Grace was alive. He had heard her voice. He had to believe. The road eventually narrowed to the point where his car couldn't pass. Levi pulled over, grabbed a flashlight from the back seat, and continued on foot. The path was rocky and overgrown, but he pushed forward, ignoring the aches in his legs and the chill in the air. After what felt like hours, he emerged into a clearing. Ahead stood a dilapidated warehouse, its rusted metal walls blending into the dreary surroundings. Levi's heart pounded. Something about the place felt wrong, ominous. But he couldn't turn back now. He approached cautiously, his footsteps quiet on the gravel. As he neared the building, he heard faint noises, the muffled cries of women and the wails of babies. Levi's stomach churned. What was this place? Peering through a crack in the warehouse door, he saw a grim scene. The interior was divided into makeshift cells, each one holding several women. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow with despair. Some clutched crying infants. Others sat silently, their swollen bellies evidence of advanced pregnancies. The air was thick with fear and hopelessness. Levi froze, torn between the urge to charge in and the overwhelming realization that Grace could be trapped in this nightmare. Just as he was about to move, a whisper broke the silence behind him. "Are you here to help us?" He spun around to see a woman, thin and trembling, crouched in the shadows outside the building. Her face was streaked with dirt, but her eyes burned with a desperate hope. "Have you seen Grace?" "My wife?" Levi asked urgently, pulling out a photo of her. The woman hesitated, glancing back at the warehouse nervously. "I think I've seen her," she said, "but you need to be careful. They have guns, and they're always watching." "Who are they?" Levi demanded. "Traffickers," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They take women like us and sell us and our babies to the highest bidder. Some of the women, they don't make it." Levi's jaw tightened, rage bubbling inside him. "Where's Grace?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Before the woman could respond, a scream pierced the air. It was raw, filled with terror and pain. Levi's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. "Grace," he whispered, his heart hammering in his chest. Without waiting for an explanation, Levi bolted toward the warehouse. The woman tried to grab his arm. "Wait, you'll get yourself killed." But Levi was beyond reason. He pushed through the door, the smell of rust and despair hitting him like a wall. The screams grew louder, guiding him down a dimly lit hallway. He didn't care who saw him or what awaited him. He had to get to Grace. As he turned a corner, he saw her. She was in a small cell at the far end of the hallway, her face pale but alive. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she clutched her belly protectively. "Levi!" she cried out, her voice a mix of relief and anguish. Levi's heart leaped. He rushed toward her, but a figure stepped into his path. It was one of the traffickers. a burly man with a cruel smile and a shotgun slung over his shoulder. "Wrong place, wrong time," the man sneered, raising the weapon. Levi didn't hesitate. Fueled by months of desperation and fury, he lunged at the man, grabbing the shotgun's barrel and twisting it away. The two struggled, the sound of their scuffle echoing through the building. Levi's adrenaline surged, giving him strength he didn't know he had. With a final burst of energy, he knocked the man unconscious. Panting, Levi grabbed the keys from the man's belt and ran to Grace's cell. Her hands reached through the bars, trembling. "Peter's okay," she sobbed. "But we have to hurry. They'll come for us." Levi unlocked the cell and pulled her into his arms. For a brief moment, the world faded away, and it was just the two of them. But the sound of hurried footsteps brought him back to reality. The traffickers were coming. "Let's get out of here," Levi said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Levi tightened his grip on Grace's hand as they sprinted down the dimly lit hallway, her swollen belly slowing her pace. Every instinct screamed at him to move faster, but he couldn't leave her behind. The sound of footsteps and shouting grew louder, echoing through the warehouse as the traffickers realized their operation was under attack. "This way," Levi urged, glancing back to make sure Grace was keeping up. I can't run much farther," she panted, clutching her belly. Her face was pale, and sweat beaded on her forehead. Levi's heart clenched, but he knew they had no time to rest. They rounded a corner, only to be met by another trafficker, a wiry man with a cruel smirk and a handgun pointed directly at them. "You really thought you could just walk out of here?" he sneered. Levi didn't hesitate. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he charged at the man, knocking the gun aside. The two struggled, the trafficker landing a punch to Levi's ribs, but Levi fought back with a ferocity born from desperation. He grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung, connecting with the man's head. The trafficker crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Grace stared, wide-eyed. "Levi, how—" "No time," Levi interrupted, taking her hand again. "We have to keep moving." They continued through the maze-like warehouse, guided by the faint light of the early morning filtering through broken windows. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. Levi knew they were running out of time. As they neared an exit, a baby's wail pierced the air. Grace froze, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. "Levi, we can't leave them. Those women, those babies." Levi hesitated. He wanted to tell her they had to go, that their own safety came first. But the anguish in her eyes stopped him. She was right. They couldn't abandon the others to this nightmare. "Okay," he said, his voice firm, "but we do this fast." Together they retraced their steps, finding the cells where the other women and children were held. Levi unlocked each one with the keys he had taken, ushering the prisoners out. The women, weak and terrified, looked at him with a mix of confusion and hope. "Follow me," Levi instructed. "We're getting out of here." The group moved as quickly as they could, the women carrying their babies or helping each other along. Levi took the lead, scanning every corner for more traffickers. Grace stayed close, her protective hand never leaving her belly. Just as they reached the exit, a shout rang out behind them. Levi turned to see two traffickers armed with rifles blocking their path. "You're not going anywhere," one of them snarled, raising his weapon. The women screamed, and Levi's heart raced. He had no weapon, no plan, just raw determination. He stepped in front of Grace and the others, shielding them with his body. "You don't have to do this," Levi said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Let us go. You don't want this to end badly for you." The traffickers laughed, their confidence unshaken. But before they could act, a deafening sound shattered the tension. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. The traffickers hesitated, their eyes darting toward the sound. Levi seized the moment. He lunged at the nearest man, wrestling the rifle away, while the other women screamed. Grace and the others ducked for cover as the scuffle intensified. Levi's strength, fueled by months of despair and a father's fierce love, was unstoppable. He disarmed the man and turned the weapon on the second trafficker, who dropped his rifle and raised his hands. The sirens grew deafening, and within moments, police officers swarmed the warehouse. The traffickers were overwhelmed, their operation crumbling under the weight of law enforcement. Levi collapsed to his knees, the rifle slipping from his hands as relief washed over him. Grace rushed to his side, her hands cupping his face. "Levi," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We're safe. We're safe." The officers moved quickly, securing the scene and escorting the women and children to safety. One officer approached Levi, helping him to his feet. "You did good," the officer said, his tone filled with respect. "We'll take it from here." Levi nodded, his body trembling from exhaustion. He turned to Grace, who clung to him tightly, and for the first time in over a year, he allowed himself to breathe. They had made it out, together. The chaos of the warehouse raid faded, as Levi and Grace sat together in a makeshift recovery area set up by the police. Grace leaned into Levi's chest, her hand resting protectively on her belly, while Levi kept an arm wrapped tightly around her. For the first time in over a year, the overwhelming weight on his chest had lifted. Grace was safe. Their baby was safe. The rescued women and children were being tended to by paramedics, their gaunt faces slowly beginning to show signs of relief. Police officers moved through the scene, cataloging evidence, arresting the surviving traffickers, and comforting the victims. Detective Barnes approached Levi, his expression serious but warm. "You've done something incredible here," he said, extending a hand. "Thanks to you, we've dismantled one of the largest trafficking rings in the region." Levi shook his hand, his grip firm, but his body trembling with exhaustion. "I didn't do it alone," he said, glancing at Grace. I couldn't let them take her. Or anyone else." Barnes nodded, his respect evident. "We're going to make sure these people pay for what they've done. But you've done your part. Go home. Take care of your family." In the weeks that followed, Levi and Grace worked to rebuild their lives. The media hailed Levi as a hero, though he cared little for the attention. What mattered was that Grace and Peter were safe, and the nightmare was behind them. The outpouring of support from the community was overwhelming. Donations flooded in to help Levi and Grace recover financially, and a local church offered them a new home, rent-free for a year. Grace spent her days preparing for Peter's arrival, while Levi worked tirelessly to regain a sense of normalcy. When the day finally came, and Peter was born in a bright hospital room surrounded by love, Levi felt a wave of emotion he could barely contain. Holding his son for the first time, he marveled at the tiny life that had been at the center of his fight. Grace, exhausted but glowing, looked at him with tears in her eyes. "We made it," she whispered. "We're here." Levi kissed her forehead, then looked down at Peter, swaddled and peaceful in his arms. "We're here," he echoed, "and I'm never letting anything happen to either of you again." Months later, Levi sat on the porch of their new home, cradling Peter in his arms. Grace joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea, and sat beside him, her hand finding his. "What now?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a mix of hope and trepidation. Levi took a deep breath, gazing out at the quiet street. The scars of the past year were still fresh, but they were healing. "Now, we live," he said. "We build the life we always dreamed of. For Peter. For us." Grace smiled, her hand moving to Peter's tiny one. "We've been through so much, but I know we're stronger now. Together." Levi nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination. They had faced unimaginable darkness, but they had emerged into the light. The fight wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming their future. As the sun set, casting warm hues over their little family, Levi held them close. The journey had been harrowing, but it had brought them here, to a new beginning, full of love and hope.